Can you imagine being a child and sleeping in a basement under a house that feasts above you? Can you imagine a rich family opening the door during a party to show their guests where you live, as if you are nothing more than a sideshow? Water drips. The bulb buzzes. Your cot scrapes against the concrete when you turn. The air is heavy, damp, and cold. Upstairs, laughter rolls through the floorboards like thunder. Fine china clinks. Music plays. And you, a 9-year-old boy, are left with silence, hunger, and the sound of your own heart beating in the dark. They run past the door and knock, laughing. The boy from below, they shout, their voices sharp with cruelty. Your name is David Okoro. Your mother works herself to the bone cleaning their marble floors and silver platters. At night, she kneels by your cot, whispering through her exhaustion, "They can keep your body in this basement, son, but never let them keep your mind here." So you read by candlelight, smuggling books under your blanket. You draw houses on scraps of cardboard. You measure each crack in the walls as if you're building blueprints for another life. And when the music upstairs grows so loud it shakes the ceiling, you say it out loud, to yourself, to the mold on the walls, to God, to anyone who will listen. One day, I will walk those halls. One day, I will buy the mansion that kept me underground. The mansion belonged to the Whitfields, one of the wealthiest families in town. Charles Whitfield was the patriarch. A towering man with slick silver hair, always dressed in tailored suits, his presence filled every room like a storm. He built his fortune on land, buying neighborhoods, pushing poor families out, building towers where homes once stood. His wife, Margaret Whitfield, was colder still. Thin lips, sharp blue eyes, always clutching a glass of wine, she treated every worker in her house like furniture to be moved, polished, and replaced. Their children, Richard and Emily, had inherited the arrogance of privilege. Richard, only a few years older than David, mocked him at every chance. Emily, though quieter, followed her parents' lead, never once offering kindness. To them, David was not a boy. He was the basement child. One evening, during a grand dinner party, Margaret opened the basement door while guests laughed over champagne. "That's where the boy sleeps," she said casually, gesturing to the dark stairwell. The guests chuckled. "How fitting," one man said. "Keeps him where he belongs." David sat frozen on his cot, their laughter raining down like stones. His cheeks burned. He wanted to scream, but his mother's words echoed in his head, "Do not let them break your spirit." He clenched his fists under his blanket. The humiliation was seared into his soul. His mother, Ngozi, was his anchor. Each night, despite aching bones, she brought him books she had borrowed or found discarded. She sat beside him and reminded him of his worth. "David, you are not less. You are more. Your father was a builder. He built with his hands. You will build with your mind. They cannot chain that." Her faith was unshakable, even as her body grew weaker from years of hard labor. "Promise me," she whispered often, "that you will rise above this basement." And David always promised. At 12, the line between humiliation and defiance cracked. Richard, swaggering through the garden one afternoon, cornered David near the hedges. He shoved him hard. "You'll never be anything but a rat under our floors." For the first time, David looked him dead in the eye. His voice shook but his words burned. "One day, I'll own a house bigger than this. And you'll wish you'd been kinder." Richard scoffed, but something in David's tone made him step back. It was the first time David had spoken his vow aloud to his oppressors. Despite being treated like less than human in the mansion, David thrived in school. His clothes were second-hand, his lunch often missing, but his grades shone. Teachers noticed his sharp mind. At 14, he began sketching houses in the margins of his notebooks, houses full of light, wide halls, and windows that breathed freedom. At 16, he won a scholarship for a summer engineering program. It was the first time he left the mansion's shadow. He saw skyscrapers, blueprints, and architects whose names carried respect. He touched models of towers and whispered to himself, "I belong in this world." When he returned, the mansion no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a challenge. But at 18, tragedy struck. Ngozi collapsed on the basement stairs, her body worn out from endless scrubbing. David rushed to her side, begging Charles for help. "Please, sir," David cried, tears streaming. "She needs a doctor." Charles's face hardened. "If she cannot work, she is of no use to me." Margaret's cold voice added salt to the wound. "Hospitals are not for people like her." That night, David held his mother's frail hand as she whispered her last words. "Promise me, son, you will not die in this basement. Rise." With tears soaking her blanket, David promised again. And moments later, the only person who ever saw his worth was gone. The basement, once his prison, became her tomb of suffering. Grief sharpened into resolve. With nothing left to bind him, David walked out of the Whitfield mansion. He carried nothing but a small bag, his sketches, and his mother's words carved into his heart. The night was cold. His steps were heavy. But each stride away from the mansion was a stride toward freedom. Life outside was brutal. He worked odd jobs, slept in a cramped hostel, ate one meal a day. Yet he studied relentlessly. He pushed through exhaustion, fueled by the memory of his mother's voice. At college, he studied architecture and business. He sketched designs at night, remembering the cracks of the basement walls as blueprints for resilience. By 21, he earned an internship at a respected firm. His supervisors marveled at his precision. Clients asked for him by name. He was no longer the boy from below. He was becoming David Okoro, the architect. One late evening, a folder landed on his desk. He flipped it open and froze. The title read, "Whitfield Mansion Renovation Proposal." His hand trembled as he traced the blueprint. Every hallway, every stairwell, every shadow of the house he knew too well, including the basement where his childhood had been buried. Fate had brought him face to face with the mansion once more. David sat alone, the blueprint glowing under his desk lamp. His chest tightened. This wasn't just another project. It was a chance to step into the house that once defined his pain, not as a servant, not as a child in the basement, but as the man asked to rebuild it. The question burned. Would he redesign the prison of his past, or use this as the first step to owning it? The blueprint sat heavy in David's hands, every line a memory he could not escape. He saw the grand stairwell where Margaret Whitfield would sweep down in gowns while his mother cleaned in silence. He saw the dining hall where guests toasted while he and his mother ate scraps below. And he saw the basement, drawn neatly in the design, a space marked storage. But to David, it was not storage. It was the place where his dignity had been buried alive. That night, he didn't sleep. He studied the plans, his chest burning. This is no coincidence, he thought. This house will not haunt me forever. It will be the symbol of my rise. David poured himself into work like a man possessed. Every assignment, no matter how small, he completed with precision. His designs were practical but elegant, his structures modern yet timeless. Supervisors noticed. Clients whispered. And soon, David was no longer just another intern, he was the one they wanted in their meetings. Yet every success reminded him of the vow he had whispered to the basement walls, "One day, I will buy the mansion above me." He knew it would take years. But he was patient. His mother's voice echoed, "Rise." During his internship, David met Elena Ruiz, a fellow architect with a sharp mind and sharper tongue. She was Latina, from a working-class family, and she recognized the fire in David immediately. "You don't just work hard," she told him one evening as they reviewed sketches. "You work like someone is chasing you." David smiled faintly. "Not chasing me. Holding me down. And I'm still fighting to breathe." Elena respected that. Over the years, their friendship grew into trust. She became one of the few people David confided in about his past, about the basement, his mother's death, and the mansion that haunted him. "You'll get there," she told him. "But don't just buy the house. Buy the whole street." Meanwhile, upstairs in the very mansion David once fled, the Whitfields' empire began to crack. Charles Whitfield, though still powerful, was losing grip. His deals grew riskier, his arrogance thicker. He dismissed new competitors, laughed at modern firms, and treated workers with the same disdain he always had. Richard Whitfield, now a young man in his 20s, mirrored his father's arrogance but lacked his cunning. He drank heavily, gambled recklessly, and relied on his father's money to clean his messes. Neighbors whispered of unpaid debts. Lawsuits circled like vultures. The mansion still gleamed, but its foundation, both literal and figurative, was weakening. And from the outside, David watched. He didn't rejoice in their downfall, but he recognized fate moving pieces into place. By 25, David had left the firm and opened his own small practice, Okoro Designs. At first, it was nothing more than a rented office with peeling paint and one old drafting table. But clients came. Slowly at first, then steadily. His designs spoke for themselves. Word spread. He took every dime he earned and reinvested it, hiring interns, upgrading equipment, moving into a modest but professional office. His company became known for one thing, turning neglected spaces into masterpieces. Warehouses into offices. Old homes into mansions. Abandoned lots into modern developments. Every project felt like a piece of justice, a way to prove that beauty could rise from places others discarded, just like he had. At a city gala, David crossed paths with Charles Whitfield for the first time since leaving the mansion. Charles still carried himself like royalty, his silver hair perfectly slicked, his suit immaculate. When introduced, his eyes flickered with recognition. "Okoro," Charles muttered, narrowing his gaze. "I know that name." David's smile was polite but firm. "Yes. You once gave me a place in your home. In the basement." For the first time, Charles faltered. His jaw tightened. "Ah. The maid's boy." He chuckled dismissively. "I see you found work." David's voice was calm. "More than work. A future." Charles waved his hand, unimpressed, and moved on. But David caught the faintest tremor in his voice, the realization that the boy he once dismissed was now a man building his own legacy. Months later, David's firm was invited to submit designs for the Whitfield mansion renovation. Richard, now officially managing parts of the estate, had pitched the idea to impress investors. The mansion needed updates, and Richard saw it as an opportunity to flaunt wealth he didn't truly have. David stared at the invitation, heart pounding. It was happening. He knew the Whitfields didn't realize who Okoro Designs truly was. But he knew. And he accepted the project with a steady hand. Walking back into the mansion for the first site visit was like stepping into a memory. The air smelled the same, polished wood, expensive wine, faint dust in the corners. He walked the halls with a clipboard, noting changes needed. Chandeliers had been replaced, wallpaper updated. But the bones of the house were unchanged. When he descended into the basement, his chest tightened. The cot was gone, replaced with boxes and tools. But he could still see himself there, 9 years old, curled under a thin blanket, listening to laughter above. He placed a hand on the wall and whispered silently, "I told you I'd be back. But not as your prisoner." Richard met David during one of the site inspections. He was older now, but no less arrogant. "So, you're the architect," Richard said, barely shaking his hand. "Do it quick and do it cheap. My investors don't care about details." David raised an eyebrow. "Quality is never cheap. If you want your investors impressed, details are everything." Richard sneered. Don't tell me how to run my house. David's smile was cold. It isn't your house I'm concerned about. It's my name on the design. Richard scoffed, storming off. But David knew the truth. Richard was drowning in debt, desperate to impress, and clinging to a mansion already slipping from their hands. While working on the Whitfield project, David's firm exploded in popularity. Other wealthy clients, impressed by his reputation, sought him out. His designs began appearing in magazines. Investors backed his developments. By 30, David wasn't just an architect. He was a developer. He began buying land, building housing complexes, creating jobs. And every deal, every blueprint, every foundation poured was one step closer to the vow he made in the basement. Meanwhile, the Whitfield's empire continued to crumble. Charles faced lawsuits over failed land projects. Richard's gambling debts grew so large that creditors came knocking. Even Margaret, once untouchable, was humiliated when her social club revoked her membership after scandals in the press. The mansion, once a symbol of power, now stood as a reminder of decline. And the man leading their renovation, the man whose name was now respected across the city, was the very boy they once locked beneath their feet. One evening, David sat in his office reviewing financial statements. His accountant entered with a smile. "David," he said, laying down the papers. "The numbers are clear. You now have the capital. If you want, you can make an offer." David looked up. "An offer?" The accountant nodded. "To buy the Whitfield mansion. It's heavily mortgaged. The family is desperate. One signature, and it's yours." David leaned back, heart racing. The mansion. The place of his humiliation. The place of his vow. Fate had brought him to the very edge of victory. But deep inside, he knew, buying the mansion wasn't just about money. It was about confronting the ghosts, the Whitfields, and his own past. Would he do it? The papers sat on David's desk like a crown waiting to be claimed. One signature, his accountant explained, and the Whitfield mansion, the place where he had once been buried in shadows, would be his. David's heart raced. For years, the vow whispered in a damp basement had driven him through hunger, humiliation, and relentless work. And now, the opportunity was here, within reach. But the decision wasn't as simple as ink on paper. The mansion wasn't just a property. It was a battlefield. To own it meant to face not only Charles and Richard Whitfield but also every ghost that lived in its walls. That night, David drove past the mansion. Its once bright windows were dim, its gardens unkempt. Paint peeled from the shutters, and weeds crept along the driveway. The house, like its owners, was fading. He parked outside, staring at the grand facade. For a moment, he saw himself at 9 years old, looking up at those same windows while clutching a torn blanket. His chest tightened. He whispered to himself, "It's almost time." Inside, the Whitfield family was unraveling. Charles sat in his study, surrounded by unpaid bills and legal threats. His silver hair was thinner, his frame heavier, his confidence cracked. Margaret paced the halls, wine glass in hand, muttering about the shame of losing status. And Richard, reckless, entitled Richard, was drowning. His gambling debts had ballooned. Creditors called day and night. He snapped at his parents, demanding money they no longer had. "This house is all we have left," he shouted one evening. Charles roared back, "And it's slipping away because of you." The family that once laughed above David's head was now suffocating under the weight of their own arrogance. In his office, David stared at the contract. Elena Ruiz, his closest ally, sat across from him. "This is it," she said. "The moment you've been waiting for. You'll own their house. You'll erase everything they did to you." David's jaw tightened. "I don't want to erase it. I want to transform it." Elena studied him. "Then do it. Sign." David picked up the pen. His hand hovered. He remembered his mother's voice, "They can keep your body in the basement, but never your mind." With a deep breath, he signed. The mansion was his. News spread quickly. Local developer purchases Whitfield Mansion, the headlines read. Reporters swarmed, eager for quotes. To the public, it was a story of irony, the son of a maid buying the house of the family that once employed her. But to David, it was more than irony. It was destiny. When Charles Whitfield learned the news, his fury shook the house. That boy. That basement rat. He thinks he can take my house. Richard was worse. We can fight this. We'll sue him, expose him. But the truth was inescapable. Their debts were unpayable. The bank had approved the sale. The mansion no longer belonged to them. It belonged to David. Days later, David arrived at the mansion to inspect his new property. Charles waited for him at the gates, his once proud shoulders hunched but his eyes still sharp. You think this makes you a man? Charles spat. Buying the house that fed you scraps. You'll never be my equal. David's voice was steady. I didn't buy this to be your equal. I bought this to prove that no one decides my worth but me. Charles's face twisted. You were nothing. You will always be nothing. David stepped closer. Then explain why the man who once called me nothing now stands outside the house he no longer owns, begging for scraps of dignity. Charles froze. The words cut deeper than any insult. Richard stormed out, his face red with fury. You stole this from us, he shouted. This is our legacy. David turned to him. Legacies aren't inherited. They're built. And you destroyed yours. Richard lunged, but Charles pulled him back. Reporters nearby caught every word, every flash of anger, every ounce of humiliation. The Whitfields had become a public spectacle. And David, calm, composed, resolute, stood as the symbol of their downfall. After they left, David entered the mansion alone. He walked slowly through each hallway, memories flooding back. The dining room, where guests laughed at his expense. The stairwell, where Margaret had flaunted her gowns. The study, where Charles had barked orders. Finally, he opened the basement door. The smell of damp concrete hit him like a ghost. He descended the stairs, each step heavier than the last. The cot was gone, but in his mind, he could see it. He could see his mother kneeling beside him, whispering words of hope. He could hear Richard's laughter, Margaret's disdain, Charles's cold dismissals. But now, he stood tall. No longer the boy from below. The owner. The master of the house. Tears welled in his eyes as he whispered, I kept my promise, Mama. I rose. David didn't buy the mansion to live in it. He had a bigger vision. He announced plans to transform it into a community center and scholarship foundation, dedicated to children like him, children overlooked, mistreated, underestimated. This mansion will no longer be a symbol of arrogance, he told the press. It will be a symbol of opportunity. The public applauded. Donations poured in. Workers lined up, eager to be part of the transformation. The Whitfields, watching from their dwindling fortune, seethed. Charles couldn't stand it. The idea of his house, his symbol of power, being turned into a community center was unbearable. He confronted David one last time, in the grand hall of the mansion. You think this is justice? He snarled. This is revenge. David shook his head. No. Revenge would be leaving this house to rot. Justice is giving it back to the people your family stepped on for generations. Charles's voice cracked. You'll regret this. But deep down, he knew he had already lost. The night before renovations began, David stood outside the mansion, looking up at its towering windows. For the first time, he felt peace. But as he turned to leave, a black car pulled up. Richard stepped out, his face twisted with rage, his voice slurred with drink. "This isn't over, Okoro," he spat. "You may own the house, but you'll never erase us. I'll make sure of it." David stared at him, calm but wary. For all his weakness, Richard was still dangerous, reckless men often are. The mansion was his, but the battle with the Whitfields wasn't finished. The night air was heavy as Richard stumbled out of the car. His eyes were wild, his tie loose, his words dripping with bitterness. "You may own the deed, Okoro," he spat, pointing a shaky finger at David. "But you'll never erase my family's name. This house will never be yours. Never." David stood tall on the steps of the mansion. His expression was calm, controlled, almost pitying. "Richard," he said evenly, "the house already told the world whose it is. Not by your name, but by your father's arrogance. And now by your failure." Richard's fists clenched, but his knees wobbled under the weight of alcohol and disgrace. He wanted a fight, but David turned his back and walked inside, leaving him shouting into the night. "This isn't over." But it was. Weeks later, news broke. Richard had been arrested for fraud and embezzlement. Desperate to maintain his lifestyle, he had dipped into illegal funds, writing checks that bounced, promising investors returns he could never deliver. Reporters swarmed. Headlines screamed. "Whitfield heir indicted. From riches to ruin." Margaret, once the queen of high society, was humiliated. Friends she once entertained with wine and laughter abandoned her. Social clubs stripped her membership. She was a ghost of herself, hiding from cameras. Charles, once a titan of land and power, was left a broken man. His lawsuits mounted. His fortune dissolved. The man who once dismissed David as nothing now lived in a rented apartment, his empire reduced to dust. The Whitfield name, once untouchable, became a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, the mansion transformed. David stood in the grand hall, watching construction crews remove the old chandeliers and replace them with bright, modern lights. The dusty rooms were cleared, repainted, reborn. The basement, his prison, was redesigned into a study hall with long desks, shelves of books, and computers. He walked through with Elena Ruiz by his side. "Every child who comes here will study where I once suffered," he said softly. "They will know the light I never had." Elena smiled. "You've rewritten the story." David nodded. "No child will ever be called the boy from below again. Not here." Months later, the community gathered for the opening of the Okoro Foundation Center. Children ran through the halls, their laughter replacing the cruel voices of the past. Parents wept as they saw classrooms filled with opportunity. The press captured every moment, the story of the boy once forced into a basement who had turned the mansion into a beacon of hope. David stood at the podium, his voice strong and steady. "I was told my place was in the shadows," he began. "I was told my future was beneath the feet of others. But today, this house tells a different story. Today, it belongs to the people. To the children who will grow, learn, and rise far beyond these walls." Applause thundered through the hall. But one figure lingered at the back of the crowd, Charles Whitfield. His hair was disheveled, his suit ill-fitted, his eyes hollow. He shuffled forward, reporters snapping photos. The crowd murmured. He stopped before David, his voice low, cracked with defeat. "You think you've won," Charles said. "But you'll never erase me." David looked him in the eye, unflinching. "I don't need to erase you, Charles. You erased yourself. Arrogance destroyed your empire. Hate destroyed your name. I only built something better on the ashes." Charles trembled, his mouth opening to reply, but no words came. He turned and walked out, swallowed by the crowd. It was the last time David ever saw him. As months passed, the mansion's new purpose grew. Scholarships funded hundreds of students. Job programs trained young adults. The once exclusive halls filled with voices of hope, not mockery. David often walked into the basement-turned-study hall. He would pause by the corner where his cot once stood. Sometimes he would close his eyes and hear his mother's voice, "Promise me, son, you will not die in this basement. Rise." And each time, he whispered back, "I kept my promise, Mama." I rose. And I lifted others with me. David's name spread far beyond the city. He was no longer just the boy from below. He became a symbol of resilience, a living story of how pain could be turned into purpose. Magazines called him a visionary. Universities invited him to speak. Children pointed at him and said, "If he could rise, so can I." But to David, the greatest victory was not fame. It was the sight of a child smiling in a library that had once been his dungeon. Standing at the mansion's entrance one evening, David gazed at the sunset painting the sky. Elena stood beside him. "You did it," she said softly. David shook his head. "We did more than that. We proved that injustice can be transformed. That a house of arrogance can become a house of opportunity. That no basement can bury a dream forever." He smiled faintly. "This is not revenge. This is redemption. And now we ask you. What would you have done, if you were David? Would you have walked away from the mansion that once broke you, or would you have turned it into a place of hope?" David's story teaches us that true justice is not about destroying your enemies. It is about rising so high that their cruelty no longer defines you, and then building a path for others to follow. If his journey inspired you, leave a comment below. Share your story of struggle, resilience, or triumph. And don't forget to subscribe to Echoes of Black Struggles, where the voices of dignity, justice, and transformation will never be silenced. Because no matter how deep the basement, victory is always possible.